Hello, I'm David Haywood, the convener for the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution World Affairs series of talks. Shortly, I will be in conversation with Palestine's leading writer, Raja Shehadeh. He is also the founder of the non-partisan human rights organisation Al-Haq, which is an affiliate of the International Commission of Jurists. His output includes several books about international law, as well as books about human rights and the Middle East. Raja was born in Ramallah in 1951, 3 years after his family was expelled from Jaffa, the country's once vibrant port. His father, Aziz Shehadeh, was a lawyer and one of the first Palestinians to advocate a peaceful two-state solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, a position that resulted in him being ostracized by his fellow Arabs. Raja was 16 in 1967 when, as he puts it, our unwanted, unrecognized neighbours from across the horizon came and took over our lives. Later he went to university in Beirut and, following law studies in London in the 1970s, returned to Ramallah to found Al-Haq, a human rights organisation that undertakes pioneering work documenting and campaigning against abuses and practicing law. Raja co-directed Al-Haq until 1991, volunteering his services as he himself continued to practice. His books, which have received a number of international awards, cross many boundaries, often being a mixture of reminiscences, travel writing and politics. His latest book, Going Home, records a poignant, thought-provoking stroll around Ramallah on the 5th of June 2017, the 50th anniversary of the Israeli occupation, during which he grapples with ageing and the failures of resistance. Good morning, Raja.
Good morning to you, David.
And how are you today?
I'm very well. It's a beautiful day.
Oh, good. It's a beautiful day here as well, so we're both lucky. So can I ask you where you're speaking from today?
I'm speaking from Ramallah at my home, where I'm sitting with shorts, which is very unusual for me on a weekday, but that's one of the advantages of lockdown. It's possible to be at home and do things without leaving the house, which I've been doing for the last 2 months now.
So you don't find it difficult, the lockdown particularly?
Not at all, because I'm used to being a lot in the house because I write most of the time. And I have a garden, and I garden and read and music and all the streaming now, live streaming keeps one company. So it's been fine.
Okay, but for the rest of the people in Ramallah, how has the pandemic affected it?
Well, we've had a good control over the spread of the pandemic because the Palestinian Authority did well, and we have had only about 548 cases, out of which almost a little over 400 have been cured, 4 deaths, and this is the 5th consecutive day without any new cases. So we're doing well with the pandemic.
It sounds like you're doing very well, particularly compared to the UK, where numbers seem to have leveled off, but we're keeping our fingers crossed. Okay, so you're speaking from Ramallah, but before you were in Ramallah, your family came from Jaffa?
Yes, my family, my father grew up in Jerusalem. Okay. And when he started practicing law, he went and opened his office in Jaffa, where his uncle was a district judge under the mandate government. And my mother grew up in Jaffa, and they both married in Jaffa and lived in Jaffa until 1948, when they were forced to leave Jaffa and came to Ramallah because they had a summer house in Ramallah. And they thought they will wait for the hostilities to end in Ramallah, where it is safer. They also had a young child by then. and didn't take anything for the winter, for example, and ended up that they never were able to return.
And before Ramallah, I think your family had some origins in Beirut?
Well, no, my grandmother, Julia Nassar, her family came from Ain Anoub, a village in the Lebanese mountains.
Okay.
They came over to Palestine in the end of the 19th century, when the whole area then was under the Ottomans. And there was none of these states that came to be in existence after the First World War were there. The whole place was under the Ottomans. And they left Lebanon to Haifa, where they established the hotel. And I followed the path of their journey because I wrote a book, Rift in Time, Travels with My Ottoman Uncle, where I was concerned to find out about my uncle Najib, great-great-uncle, Najib Nassar, who was an editor of the famous newspaper El Carmel. And I went to Lebanon, to Ain Anoub, and saw the place where they came from, and followed their trip along to Palestine.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that you're finding being locked down not too problematic, but you use social media. So have you been talking to friends and colleagues?
Well, I don't really like talking on social media to friends, I must say.
Okay.
I'm sorry, David. It's not something that I'm used to, and I much prefer personal contact. But in the case of the lockdown, that has become very difficult and almost sometimes impossible. And it has always been difficult to meet with my friend Henry Abramovich, about whom I mentioned in Where the Line is Drawn, the book that I wrote a few years back. And we decided that it's going to take such a long time to be able to meet again, although he lives in Jerusalem, which is about 45 minutes drive only. So we decided to try and do it by Skype. And this was my first Skype social visit since the lockdown. And we met, and it was okay. We exchanged news, and I heard about him and his family and so on. And the second one was with my publisher, Andrew Franklin, in England. And that is all. I haven't done any more. But I think I will do a few more now that things are getting to be impossible to meet physically.
Yeah. And you're also, I suppose, getting more used to the technology.
In a way, but I still find it strange to speak to somebody on who's in a machine somehow. But I'll get used to it, I think.
Yes, I think that, you know, the personal contact is very important. And it reminds me of your books and how when you're, particularly in the books that have walking as a basis to them, it's like walking alongside you, because you're talking about the things around you, and it's almost like having a conversation.
Yes, walking has always been very important for me, and I get most of my ideas from walking. And during this time, we take short walks around, and we've done a few hill walks, but we're under curfew from 10 o'clock in the morning until from 7 o'clock in the evening until 10 o'clock in the morning. And so we can't go out early in the morning when the weather is cooler. But we do walks on the roof. And even the walks on the roof, looking at the clouds and hearing the birds, give me some ideas and make me feel much better to do the walks.
Oh, well, we've been told that we can relax some of our containment now, although it's a little bit confusing exactly what the rules are. So in the West, I mean, you're best known as a writer of political and non-fiction, but you started off as a lawyer. How did that come about?
Well, I really was always writing. I started writing a diary immediately after the 1967 occupation. And that was in order to find some clarity because everything was so confusing and so changed that I was getting confused and needed to understand what was happening. And I thought keeping a diary would help me out, and it did. And I never stopped writing diary ever since. And the diary has been an important source of many of my books. And I've always aspired to write and write clearly and explore personal issues and so on. So I started writing alongside, even when I was a student at university. And when I came back, I started the law. I didn't want to become dependent for my livelihood on the writing because I thought that would restrict me on what I can write and how I can write. And I think that was a good idea because that way I'm free to write as I want without having to depend on the writing and therefore cater for public tastes and so on. And be worried that I will not get enough to live on from the writing and so on. And when I came back and started the law and Al-Haq, I was doing almost three careers because I was doing human rights work, I was doing the legal practice, and I was doing writing. And I managed to write a lot even then. But as time went on and I became well, Al-Haq, for example, stood on its own 2 feet and I could leave it, which happened in 1991. And in the case of the writing, I continued to write alongside with my practice until the last few years when I started doing more writing than practicing. And I think for good writing, you need more time. I always thought you can do it alongside other things, but now I realize that the more time you give it, the better the outcome is.
Okay, so you started Al-Haq, you are a lawyer. There's obviously a kind of family history in this. You mentioned your father, you mentioned, I think, your grandfather. So I think your father was a very important influence in your life.
Oh yes, oh yes. He was a very important lawyer in Palestine, and he was a top lawyer really, and he was very dedicated to public causes and had his own mind on things, and knew what should be done, and was courageous enough to say it. Even in '67, when everybody was going in another way, he said we have to come to terms with Israel, recognize Israel, and Israel has to recognize us as a nation with self-determination, and we should make a resolution of the conflict along the lines of two states, two separate states side by side. And he did everything he could to propagate that idea. And before that, he was involved with many other important cases and with negotiations in the Lausanne in 1949, and he had a whole history of public involvement. And he was a very important a challenge to me in my life. And we had sometimes a complicated relationship because maybe I expected a little too much, and I didn't want a traditional relationship between father and son. And sometimes I didn't take into consideration his age and maybe expected too much. So it's been an issue for me that I've been exploring through in the course of my writing in many of my books.
Yes, and unfortunately, he was murdered as well, wasn't he?
Yes, in 1985 he was murdered, and Israel would not properly investigate his murder for many years and never actually did. And finally, and of course, in the beginning, the media announced that he was killed by the PLO, which was never the case. It wasn't true at all. And we found out later on that he was murdered by one of the defendants in a case of eviction that he took against a man from Hebron who threatened him from prison that if you don't withdraw from the case, I will kill you. And when he got out of prison, he acted on his word and did kill him.
Okay.
And he was never brought to trial by Israel, which is very unfortunate.
Yes. Coming back to Al-Haq, Could you describe just a little bit, the work that they have done over the years, the important things that they've achieved, and your involvement with them?
Well, when I came back from my studies in England in 1978, I found out that there was so much happening on the legal aspects of the occupation that was totally unknown and uncovered. And the world believed at that time that the occupation was the most benevolent in history. And of course, that was very, very far from the reality. But there wasn't any documentation to support that it wasn't the case. And there wasn't any documentation on what Israel was trying to do to annex in a de facto manner and in a de jure manner, actually, the occupied territories and to facilitate the building of establishment of settlements, Jewish settlements in the occupied territories. And so I thought there is a big lacuna which had to be filled somehow. And I tried to do my own writing on the subject, but of course, it was too big a task for one individual. And I think it needed an organization of people who would investigate these human rights violations all over the occupied territories, and a team of people doing the research and the writing and so on. And that was how Al-Haq came into being. And in the course of its life, and this continues today, it has covered almost all aspects of the occupation, the legal aspects of the occupation. There was a lot of writing on the land issues, on the settlements issues, on the human rights violations of the prisoners. And now it's involved in the International Court of Justice, in the criminal court, International Criminal Court, which is beginning to investigate the criminal activities, war crimes of Israelis in the course of the occupation. And Al-Haq has provided a lot of evidence for the court to support that contention. So Al-Haq has been extremely important in bringing to light things that otherwise would not have been covered about the illegal aspects of the occupation, the human rights aspects of the occupation.
Okay. Are you still involved with Al-Haq? I mean, obviously, on going home, you went to the office.
Yeah. Well, in 91, I joined the negotiations in Washington between the PLO and Israel, although the PLO was not directly involved then. And these happened before the secret Oslo negotiations. So I was a legal advisor to the delegation in Washington. And as such, I realized that I'm going to be away for lengthy periods of time, long periods of time, and I couldn't continue as a co-director, although I was doing it voluntarily, of course, as a co-director while I was in Washington. And at the same time, I realized that there was a political aspect to my work in Washington. And at Al-Haq, we insisted that no one should take a political position while working for Al-Haq. And so I realized that I had to withdraw. And by then, the organization had grown to such a point that they could do without me. And that was always my hope, that I would get to the point when they can do without me. And so I stayed away, stopped being co-director. And now I continue to follow their work and to advise when needed and to write things and promote their work and so on. But that's as far as my involvement is concerned.
Okay. So let's come back to your books, which in the introduction I described that they're sort of odd mix because they are clearly a mixture of memories and your stories that you tell to yourself whilst you're walking, and politics. So they're not...
And law.
Yes, yeah. So in what way has your work developed over the years?
Well, it developed in that I realized how to write and what it takes to write a good book. I think I had written 2 other books before Strangers in the House. They were The Third Way and The Sealed Room. And they were short books and perhaps not very accomplished. in the Strangers in the House, I realized what it takes to write a good book, and how much effort and time that you have to put into it. And that was a book about mainly about my relationship with my father and the development of that relationship. And it was a very important book for me to write in order to be able to go beyond it and write other books. And then after that, I wrote about the re-invasion of the West Bank by Israel in 2002. And that was a preparation for the present lockdown, because then we were under lockdown, under curfew, complete curfew for a whole month. And so we had to manage without leaving the house. And that was a good preparation for now, in a way. And then I followed it by other books. And the book that made a big difference in my career was Palestinian Walks, which I've always wanted to write, but never thought I could get away with writing such a book, because it was about walking. And I thought it would be impossible to publish a book about walking. And then when I spoke to the publisher, he said, well, I think it is a very good idea to write a book about walking, since you like walking. And so I wrote this book in which I described walks over a period of quarter of a century, 6 walks that take place over a quarter of a century. And in that book, I managed to speak about the land and the development of the law, and describe cases. And so it helped people understand about the situation without feeling that they were being instructed. And it was about walks and about nature and about the changes in the landscape and the development of the settlements and the vanishing landscape and how it changed over time. So it was a thrill to write, and it did very well, because so many people around the world like walking, and so felt very strongly that in that book they had the experience of walking alongside me over the hills and the landscape of Palestine. And then later on, I wrote my most recent book has been Going Home, which is a book that is different from Palestinian Walks, because Palestinian Walks took place over a quarter of a century, and this book takes place over the course of one day. And in the course of one day, which happens to be on the 50th anniversary of the Israeli occupation, I walk from home to my office and back to the house. And that is all that is covered in the book.
You say that is all that is covered in the book. That was the first book. That is the first book of yours that I read. And it was so emotional. I just, I read that book and I thought, I've got to read the rest of this man's books, because it is just so wonderful. I thank you very much for Going Home, because it introduced me to your other books. A book that was very different, though, was the one before, Going Home, Where the Line is Drawn, because that is very much about relationships rather than a walk. Would you like to say a little bit about Where the Line is Drawn?
Yeah, Where the Line is Drawn, I wanted to show that the relationship between Israel and Palestine has changed over the years. It has not always been the way it is now, where there is total separation, where there is a wall, where there are checkpoints, where it is almost impossible for a Palestinian to visit the other side, except under very strict restrictions. And I wanted to show that the relationship has changed over the period of the 40 years that the book covers. So I started the book with the idea of doing crossings. I thought I would do 12 crossings over the years, and show how the process of the crossing was, how easy it was, and how more difficult it became, and how much more difficult it became over time. And I realized that many of these crossings were in order to visit friends who are Israeli on the other side. And so I described these friends and described my relationship with these friends. And then I realized that over the last years, many of these crossings were to visit my close friend Henry Abramovich, and so he became a central character in the book.
Yes.
And I described our relationship, which has been not easy, and it has gone had its ups and downs. And then during the Intifada, the first Intifada, I got so angry with him, I didn't want to see him, and then that changed again, and so in a way, the emotional relationship, the friendship, has reflects in a way the relationship between the two sides over the years.
Yeah. But you said earlier on that you spoke to him recently via Skype or something. So you're staying in touch.
Oh yes, we're staying in touch. And you know, when I was writing the book, I told him I'm writing the book and I'm writing about you, and can I use your poetry and your letters? Because what we did over the years, even when we didn't meet face to face, was to exchange letters.
Yeah.
And I'm the kind of person who doesn't throw any scrap of paper. So I have found all these letters. I still had them. And I told him, I would like to use your letters. Is that okay? And he said, absolutely, use whatever you like. And then I didn't want to show him the manuscript when I finished it, because I thought that's not how I write, and I don't want to show him the manuscript. And when the book was published, the first person to read it was Henry. Okay. And I held my breath to see how Henry would feel about the book. And he loved it. He was very, very happy with it. And actually, just recently, before the Skype conversation, he told me he was reading it again and was finding it even more thrilling than the first time he read it. I suppose the first time he was a bit nervous, and the second time he didn't have to worry about it. So he liked the book very much, and our friendship, I think, has only increased over the years. There was no diminishing of the friendship at all. And the book helped.
Although, as you say, it was a bit rocky at times because you both had your tensions.
Of course, because, you know, he's not a political person. And it's not that I expect him to be political, but sometimes I expected him to be a little more aware of my conditions. And sometimes I felt he was being insensitive by not mentioning or asking me how difficult it was for you to come over, what does it take, and so on. And that made me feel at times that he was not being empathetic, but in fact he was, and his way of being empathetic was not in the way that I expected, I suppose. And he's not political. He's a psychoanalyst, and he doesn't want to be political, nor do I want him to be political. I have so many friends who are political, and we talk a lot about politics when we meet, and I didn't want yet another relationship where we spoke politics all the time. So yeah.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. So I know you're working on some new books, but you don't like to talk about those. But I know that you have been to Bath a couple of times in the past. Was that for book promotion?
Well, I was invited to the Bath Literary Festival in 2011 and 2017. 2011 was the first time that I visited Bath, and I took the opportunity to make tourism, to do some touring. And I really loved that place. And the festival was very inspiring, and I enjoyed it very much. And then in 2017, when I wrote Where the Line is Drawn, I was invited again to the festival. And again, the event went very well, and I enjoyed the festival. And although the second visit was a much shorter visit, because I was doing a tour of several other festivals. And so it was the first time in 2011 that I really visited the place.
Okay. Well, obviously, if you come back again, we would very much like to see you. But I know that...
Back, yeah.
Yes, I know that it is difficult at the moment for you and for all people who are on these sort of tours promoting books and other things because of the lockdowns. I think you were due to go to Edinburgh?
I was due to go to Ireland.
Ireland, okay.
And possibly Edinburgh, because I've been involved in the Edinburgh Book Festival since 2011, every year, 2001. every year of the festival, I've been involved in the festival. So it was very likely that I would be involved this year. But to be honest, I've been to so many festivals and done so much traveling all over that when the lockdown happened, I was not unhappy, I must say. And I thought it was good to relax a bit and experience life at home without thinking of the next travel and preparing for the next travel. So I think after this, I will certainly change, and many things will change because now I'm doing so many promotional things over the internet. Of course, I have an event on Saturday for the new book in New York, and I'm doing another event in tomorrow for a book of a friend of mine, Rashid Khalidi. And so there's a lot happening anyway, and without leaving the house, without having to prepare for the travel, without having to go through the agonies of travel. So it's changed, and maybe to the better.
Okay, well, I am really grateful for the time that you've given us for this talk. I'm glad we were able to slot it in amongst all of your other video conferencing. It's been really great to meet you, Raja, and I'm looking forward to your next book.
Thank you. The pleasure is mine. I'm looking forward to meeting you face to face.
Okay. Well, let's plan on that if you are allowed out and when the travel restrictions are withdrawn.
Yes, certainly.
Okay. So thank you again, Raja.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.